Hello, my friends. I am so excited for you to meet today's guest. Amelia Hruby is an exceptional human being, and she is also a past member of the Checkbox Other family. So I'm so excited because I feel like this is like a family reunion and introduction all at once. Amelia was our first editor of the podcast. I talk a little bit about it in the episode, but originally, when I first started this podcast, I was playing all the parts. I was the producer, the editor, the talent booker, the marketer. What other ers I can add? I don't know. But what happened was, in many things, when you try to do all the things, you aren't able to do them fully, and you exhaust yourself and burn yourself out. As somebody that does a lot of work around burnout, it's kind of funny to think back and see how I just stepped into all of my own versions of my burnout traps. And so Amelia was the incredible gift that dropped into my lap through actually an organization called The Wing. Some of you might have heard of it. They used to have this directory of the other members. And I found her there and I connected with her and looked at her website and immediately was like, oh my goodness, Amelia needs to be part of the Checkbox Other family. She has been an incredible supporter since we were working together. And then she, as she mentions in the episode, had to stop working with clients because she was, working on her dissertation for her PhD, which we talk all about in this episode, and her work with regard to feminism and so much more. If you are somebody that is interested in how you can add your own self-love through your understanding and love of your body, this episode, we dive into that so very much. And it was such a wonderful gift and a level of generosity that I'm so grateful for that Amelia brought today. We also talk about the importance of us sharing our voices and taking up space in a world that oftentimes tells those of us who haven't been seen as the powerful ones to be quiet. And so we talk a lot about the importance of understanding where you have power and how you can use power, and also shifting maybe your relationship and your mindset about what it is to take up space, and understand that your relationship with yourself and your body is a really, really powerful one. So before I take up all the time telling you about what the episode is, let's hop into it. I'm excited for you to get to know Amelia. Amelia, welcome to Checkbox Other. This is so cool that you are on this side of Checkbox Other of the microphone, and you get to have this wonderful relationship with the audience that they might not have even known they had with you already. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so happy you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be on this side of the pod.
Yes. I have already jammed about this in the intro, but let me just say one more time. Amelia was such a formative part of what turned this podcast into something that became less of a weight for me and more fun and enjoyable, and allowed me to be so present. And so we're going to jam on some of that today and so many other amazing things. But I just want to, I guess, express my gratitude to you because, in the intro is great too, but you don't get to miss it. So thank you so much for being such an integral part of the evolution of this podcast. And I'm so excited for the audience to meet you. So I am like, all right. As I told you before, sometimes I get so excited that I forget to ask people questions. So I'm going to start off and pass the mic to you for you to share what I like to call the Cliff Notes version of your journey, the twists, the turns, the aha moments that led you where you are today and, where you're heading next.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. I'm so happy to have been a part of Checkbox Other in the past and to be back on the show now. The Cliff Notes version of my journey. So my name is Amelia Hruby, as folks have figured out by now. I grew up in North Carolina, so Southeast. Grew up there, went to college there, and then today we'll say the journey began when I started grad school. So coming out of college, I went to grad school to get a PhD in philosophy. I moved to Chicago, and it really just took my life in a totally different path than I had kind of been on. So when I got there, I was taking philosophy courses. I learned a lot about feminism. I started taking women's and gender studies courses. And I really had a personal and political awakening that led me into some activist work. It led me into a lot of creative work. I started writing a lot more. I created, eventually, I started a series on Instagram that eventually became a book called 50 Feminist Mantras. What else happened? I started working with a really amazing group that's no longer in existence called Fourth Chicago, that was for creative women entrepreneurs in Chicago. So I kind of brought my work there. We started a podcast together. I worked at a radio station. I learned how to podcast. Like, Chicago is really, when I was there for 7 years, and that's really where I found feminism. I found podcasting. I found entrepreneurship. I found all the things that are kind of the most central parts of myself now. And it was really just a beautiful formative time. And then I kind of, in the earlier part of the pandemic, just realized that Chicago was not a place that I could see a future for myself anymore. I really couldn't. It just, in the pandemic, became a place that was really hard to live for me. And so I decided to move. And in September of 2020, I moved with my partner to Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where I live now.
Nice.
Yeah, it's where my family's from. And I would say since then, I've really been on this sort of ancestral journey, going back to the literal land where my ancestors immigrated from Europe in the mid to late 19th century, exploring where my parents grew up. I now live 3 blocks from my grandmother's house. She moved into that house in 1955. Like, it's been a really beautiful evolution. And since I moved here, I started my own business called Softer Sounds. So I've really, so much has changed. That's today's version of the story. There's so much more we're going to get into, but that's at least a little bit of how I landed here in this conversation.
I just need you to know, I started this conversation all hot because I was all excited to chat. And as you're talking about so many elements of your journey that I don't know you're going to bring up, I was covered in chills. There are so many parts of what you just talked about that resonated personally with me, but I feel like resonate with so many different aspects of, even if it's not manifesting in the same way externally, what we've been going through in the last few years, but also as we start to kind of claim and understand and reclaim our identity as we grow up and as we grow into ourselves more. There was so much beauty in the way that you shared that. And it's funny because recently, like a couple podcasts ago, not the best of this, maybe a month ago, not even, I dropped a podcast because I just moved to New York City. For the first time. I've been, we'll say 20 years in Boston. I went to college and then was there and never really planned to stay there that long. And then was on my own journey to call what I called my heart home. And a big part of that was really being in spaces and feeling the surroundings around me, feeling, am I buoyed here? Do I belong here? Is there a part of me that's meant to be here? And it's funny because I went to Lisbon. I had this plan. I talk about it in the episode of like kind of doing a road trip around the country to be like, does this place feel good? Like try this on for size for a few days. And then, variants and all the like thwarted all those plans. But the thing that's so fascinating and I feel like is beautiful in both the Chicago element of what you just talked about and Nebraska is being able to feel like you stepped into yourself, stepped into that, the philosophy of Amelia, being able to step in Chicago and be able to explore all that and to, spread your wings and become even more yourself than you were before. And then also stepping into the importance of connecting to where you came from in the Nebraska move of, rooting down and spreading out and understanding and learning and literally walking the lands that your people walked, right? Like there is something so powerful to that. And in moving to New York, I didn't even think about it, honestly, until I realized, oh, wait, my grandparents, my grandfather worked in the city and it was an architect for the city of New York, so built a lot of what's here. My father, when he came to America, was here. Just so much of a lot of story that like I haven't heard yet is here, and I can feel that story in walking around and being present in it, even if I don't know if where they were exactly. There is so much power in occupying the same space, which obviously we talk a lot about how, when people have been forcibly removed from places, how important it is to kind of reclaim and kind of re-indigenize themselves in spaces that they've been removed from. And in that way, being able to go back and reconnect with parts of the journey that have made you become who you are is so powerful. So I am so grateful, because I feel like your story hopefully resonates with so many people as we are trying to figure out, who am I and what am I doing in this life, especially after the last 3 years of being like, wait, it's dangerous to breathe. Okay, I got to reassess all that too. So I babbled for a while. Now I'm back to warm. So we got the chills through. My favorite question, why it's called Checkbox Other, is what I ask everybody. Can you tell me about a time, or if you want to share more than one time, it's always welcome, where you have felt other or different, or as though you didn't belong?
Yeah, so many times. This is something I've always loved about your podcast, this segment. I think one of the most maybe formative moments of not belonging for me was stepping into grad school, was being this 22-year-old woman who'd actually never studied philosophy in a philosophy PhD program. It was very clear to me that I had no lay of the land and no understanding of how that world worked when I got there. And I can remember my first few experiences in classrooms, particularly. I think a lot of people have othering experiences in classrooms, but I just remember I had kind of come in with all of my intellect and all of my confidence in myself coming out of college, and I got there and I was like, whoa, I do not belong. I was told that by some people. It was both implicit and explicit, and that was really challenging. And I was in grad school for 7 years. So I worked through that over that period of time as I completed my PhD, which never would have been possible without, I think in my 4th year, my mentor joined our program, got a job there. And when she was there, I was actually able to see myself in her and complete the program and do all these things. So that's one moment. But the other one I want to just mention, because of the day we're recording this, today marks 4 years since I broke up with diet culture. This has been a big part. Thank you. It's been a big part of my journey. And since then, I'm still figuring out language to talk about this, but I've really come out as fat to my community, to the internet. And it's a really othering experience. We live in a deeply fat phobic society. I have some pretty, what I would call archetypal fat experiences. Like the first time you're in a doctor's office, the first time you're at the dermatologist and they tell you that you're fat, or when you go to a doctor to look at a mole and they're like, you should really lose weight. I have a lot those are moments when I felt completely othered. And it's been a really beautiful journey of reclaiming even the word fat for myself, recognizing what other people mean by it, what I choose to mean by it, empowering myself through it. And that's something I work on all of the time. And I've just been thinking about it a lot right now and wanted to share it today, I guess, just because we're recording this on the anniversary, which is a special day for me.
I am so happy that you're recording it. I mean, recording it here, because because I get to be a part of the celebration. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I feel like what you just talked about is something that is a constant inundation around us all the time, of how our bodies are not meant to be the way that they are.
Yes.
I feel ashamed my face as you were talking about the dermatologist. I'm like, none of your business, dude. Like, what? That's not it. And it's really fascinating to think about how deeply ingrained that type of messaging has to be for somebody else to be bringing it up all the time when it's not even relevant, right? And then to in turn be like, all right, well, if you're going to bring it up in inappropriate places, I'm going to own what it is to be fat. I'm going to own what it is to love my body the way that my body is, and really have that power given back and shifted back to me, versus whatever the kind of spraying of shame that we do in our society to make us all feel like we're not enough and we're small, because that person's not saying that in a way that makes them feel any better, genuinely.
Yeah.
But it is this kind of false, I always think of it as, a coach of mine used to talk about how we we can feed ourselves like pellets that never actually satiate our hunger, but we're eating. It's like
Mhm.
that. I feel like there's a whole lot of that in our society, of how we interact with each other by trying to jockey for position, only to realize that though I stepped on you, I'm no further along or no more complete than I was before that happened. And so it is really, I think, powerful to not only 4 years, heck yeah, but to take the time and space to celebrate, own, and honor. And I think the fact that you have defined this for yourself and saying this is the celebration of 4 years of see you later diet culture, but also the permission you've granted yourself of being like, I don't actually know fully how I define this yet or where it's going, but I'm on the journey and I'm appreciating it. I think there's so much power in the anchored groundedness and the willingness to step into the curiosity and the space for growth. So thank you so very much for bringing that here. And also, I don't want to lose the kind of philosophy part too, that I think is so resonant too. That feeling of, if you didn't do all these things, you don't belong here. If you don't embody this, if you haven't been to these schools or these, have these credentials, then what are you doing here? It's really fascinating because I feel like that happens to people across the board. And I love how you said a lot of other happens in the classroom.
Mhm.
Classroom is something that I've learned recently is been centered around this model of Prussian education system that was all around obedience. And so
Mhm.
when we think about a classroom that's teaching us things and teaching us information we need to be fully formed humans, but it's also telling us that we have to be obedient, we have to abide by a very specific way of looking at the world, then obviously there's going to be a lot of ourselves is not allowed here. I just listened to, we were talking about this before, and I just listened to Meghan Markle's podcast with Mindy Kaling,
Mhm.
and she was talking about it's called archetypes. They talk about different archetypes. This particular one was the spinster archetype. But what she talked about, which I felt like resonated so much, is you were like, I was in school for 7 years, so I worked through that feeling of not belonging. Was that Mindy Kaling said that people, even when she started the Mindy Project, people were like, oh my God, are you so nervous? Do you have imposter syndrome? And she's like, I was at the office for however many years. If I'm feeling imposter syndrome right now, then there is something much bigger happening here than imposter syndrome. And so I
Mhm.
love so much that you shine a light on it, and also say that like you proved you belonged there by not only seeing yourself there, but then seeing other people that looked and felt and had the same kind of background as you. And you paved the way for the next group of people that can be like, oh, Amelia was here. Thanks so much. I feel like I want to be more like Amelia. So I belong here too. So I think that's so beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about, as you stepped into that like philosophy element of this stuff? Because I've already said this before, but I feel like I'm going to nerd out really hard. So,
That's great.
but I'd love to hear, as you at 22 stepped into the philosophy around feminism and really reclaiming and understanding your relationship to the word feminism, the belief, the operating principles, and how that informs so much of not only how you work today, but I would imagine how you live today as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, feminism is such an umbrella term. Like it means so many different things. And many people call themselves feminists that I might even say, like, even politically, I deeply disagree with them, like it contains so much. Um, in terms of my journey to feminism, I always kind of think of it in two ways, like two paths or intertwined paths. I think that many of us come to feminism through our lived experiences. And I saw this with my students too. I taught at the university I was getting my PhD at for 5 years. I had hundreds of students come through my intro to sex and gender class, as it was called. And I really it was kind of one of two things.
Mm.
People arrive there because they've had an experience of discrimination, inequality, oppression of some type, and they're trying to make sense of their life. And I definitely had experiences like that, moments where I was sexually harassed or where I saw, you know, someone who was presented as more masculine than me, or identified as, a man, get a promotion or get something that I was never considered for, even though we had the same credentials, those types of lived experiences that make patriarchy visible to us. And so I think a lot of people come to feminism from that. And then because I was in the university setting, there's also like many people arrive at feminism, by reading about it or through the sort of exploration of like somebody assigned this reading and I like blew my mind. And I suddenly saw myself in these words on the page. That happens all the time when people are reading, particularly I would say like Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks for the first time. They're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I was experiencing this. And it's exactly what has happened, what I've been living for years. So, the same thing happened to me. It was a combination of, being in this university setting, philosophy programs. I think it's like philosophy and physics are the most male dominated field disciplines in
Oh,
higher ed. Maybe not at this stage, but even 5 or 10 years ago. And so I was in this very male dominated field. I was trying to find my place in it, feeling into all the ways that, all the places that discrimination hid, I would say, under the guise of liberal education and quote unquote good politics, university politics, good politics. And at the same time, I was studying with these faculty members who were activists and academics, particularly in the Women and Gender Studies department, not so much in my department, but who were really doing this like radical work that was so exciting to me. So that's kind of how I came to feminism. And then from there, like what feminism came to mean for me was really just liberation. Like for me, feminism is really centering freedom. It's centering interdependence. It's centering different ways of relating to each other. It said like the fight against patriarchy, the fight against white supremacy, the fight against capitalism, and against all of these power dynamics, and what all of those major systems of oppression share is a power over structure, and they all attempt to oppress through domination. And so I started to see, both on a very personal level, the ways that I wanted to work against those things in my life, such as critiquing diet culture, quitting dieting, those sorts of practices, along with the ways that I wanted to be involved in larger efforts to change systems in the world. And so, that really led me kind of one of the first things I did with that is I started writing feminist mantras on Instagram back in 2016. And those are really just like affirmations that I was creating around different feminist values. And I would say I have a really values-based feminist practice. A lot of people, when they think about feminism, the first thing they think about are political issues. And I think there are like feminism is political issues are very important, but I've really always centered for myself like feminism as a way of life, where I'm really trying to always interrogate gender in our society, connect with myself and what my gender expression and presentation and identity day to day, where I'm always trying to reject patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist values and instill different values. And so those mantras and affirmations became a way that I was really trying to center a new value system in my life and share that with other people. And that eventually became my book, 50 Feminist Mantras, which is, kind of year-long journaling practice organized by seasons. And it's interesting, the reviews of the book have really been like, oh, I thought this was going to be about politics. And it's like, not. Which is fine, because I'm really trying to open people into this idea that like feminism can be a way of life. And that should include like political values and actions, but that's not all that it is. Like for me, feminism is living a slower life, a more sustainable life, a more loving life, a more liberated life, and always trying to share that with others so that they can live all of those things too.
ooh, I had to like restrain my neck from nodding, my head from nodding off, because I think there's so much power in what you just talked about on I think the level of talking about awakening, right? Of awakening through books and awakening through really being able to bear witness to things inside yourself, living outside yourself on paper in words you didn't know existed to me.
Mhm.
There's something so powerful about that. And again, feeling like you were seen in this work that is, if you've heard the word without that kind of, here's the meat of what we're talking about, oftentimes, especially I think you and I are around the same age, feminism had language, but there was a roughness to it, a rigidity to it, a
Yeah.
coldness to it. There wasn't this sense of um, connectedness to self. There was definitely
Mhm.
not this sense of like love and warmth. It was meant to be weaponized in the way that it was talked about in public discourse, if it was talked about at all.
Mhm. Yeah.
It was equivalent, much more so, to man hating, which
Yeah.
unfortunately still, because patriarchy is very much still here, when
Yeah.
words get used so very much, they get diluted. And when they get kind of perverted by particular groups to mean something that they do not, and they have a microphone and they have a platform that can be heard further and louder and longer, and also go along with what people are used to based on that obedient training they've learned, it
Mhm.
can be really challenging to then just merely operate as as somebody that is quote counterculture, even though the culture that you're operating in is slowly draining each and every one of us of our humanity. And so being able to reclaim that while also learning so much about yourself and the world around you at the same time, like there is this sense of, oftentimes when I talk about this, I think, are you a Game of Thrones fan by chance?
Yeah. I
I
am.
always think of Hodor when I'm thinking about like when we're trying so hard to hold space for something that is so meaningful, but we have all of the evil forces pushing at us from everywhere, and we're like, all right, I've got the world on my shoulders for real, to the point where the only thing I can say, the only thing I can focus on is keeping that survival mechanism alive. There is so much to the oppressive elements of what we're dealing with right now that do make it so when we talk about feminism, it at this point hopefully is a little bit further along, but it is like, oh, well, that's political. It's like, no,
Yeah.
actually, it's so much more than that. But the only space that it seems to be getting amplification might be in that political sphere. And so it doesn't mean it doesn't exist there, but also it means so much more if you allow it, if you let it kind of seep into a way of questioning the programming that you have. And so I love so very much how you talked about that. I'd love to hear what your thought. I like nerded out and scribbled over here when you were talking about kind of power over culture. I mean, across
Mhm.
all the isms or all the archies, um, right, like how we talk about power over as just the default way we think we're supposed to live, and the opportunity to actually find power in other spaces in other ways, and even more so, at least the way that I believe. And for those of you that are listening, you probably heard me say this in the intro at the beginning, I actually believe that power is in the collective, and so it's really difficult to have power over. Can you talk a little bit about how shifting that relationship to power and understanding power as you shine a light on how these systems are actually pushing this forward has changed or shifted your way of operating with the world?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really beautiful question. Um, like the first thing that comes to mind is I think when a lot of people, when we learn about the archies and the isms, as you put it, when we learn about um, maybe particularly the isms, we learn about racism and sexism and um, colonialism and all of these, we especially, it can kind of instill this idea that power is bad. And I think that this comes along with some of the discourses around privilege and how we navigate privilege. And there is a sort of sense that like power is bad, privilege is bad. And so you should always like, you should be disowning it. Like you want to like push it away. I'm like making a movement.
Yeah.
um, but that's really, I think what ends up happening is we just end up abandoning ourselves in that process. And we end up like what we actually have to learn to do is find power within ourselves that's not based in the values of those systems or what those systems find meaningful or tell us is valuable about us. And so, if I think on my personal journey, it's been a lot to unpack this. And it really takes, I think, a lot of vulnerability and honesty with yourself around like where do I have power and where do I lack power? Because as I've worked with people over time, I've learned that like we're just as like, it can be really hard for us to see where we have power and just as hard for us to see where we lack power. There are so many places, I think, especially even within feminism, where we're told like this is empowerment, and it's like
You're like, why does it
liposuction.
feel that way? Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm like you're like no, like lipo is not empowerment. And that's not to get into a whole discourse around anything else, but it's just like we're kind of given, especially now, like I think that just like what is power and should I want it and is it okay to have it? These questions just swirl. And so I
Yeah.
think for me, what I really tried to do is always go back to like, what are my core values? What are my core feminist values? How are these core values feminist? And how can I find power in these things and empower myself and others in these ways? And something I try to do in all the relationships in my life. I think it's something I definitely really try to do in my business, but it's challenging because those like it's Patricia Hill Collins talks about power, like power over and like the matrices of domination, the matrices of domination. And so, we live within that. And it's really hard to find a different type of power in yourself or with others within that system. And, I've been a part of radical spaces that try to operate on non-hierarchical models that collapse just because people are always trying to, put that hierarchy in there. And so at this stage, the best I've got is like what we can do is be really like always be identifying and naming power, trying to be really transparent about who has power when and where, why that person may have been granted that power, and if we have opportunities to shift it to a collective instead of an individual. Like, I don't have answers for how to like resolve power over, but I think that's definitely the movement that I am, trying to do. And I think that last piece is really important. Like anytime we can resist individualism and promote collectivity, as you said when you asked me this question, like that's a place where we are unraveling power over. And that's, I think, always a move we can and I want to be making.
Yeah. And it's so funny because there's a couple things that you mentioned that I feel like I know there's so much nuance in what you're saying. And also because the words have been pirated in such a way that
Mhm.
like power is not a dirty word if you fit a particular demographic prototype. If you have, if you fit what power is supposed to fit with, it isn't seen as dirty. It is seen as birthright. It is seen as
Yeah.
responsibility, and it is destiny, right?
Mhm.
And it's really fascinating because as we talk about understanding how individualism is dangerous in some ways, but also for those of us that tend to be told to be small, to be quiet, to disappear, to minimize ourselves,
Mhm.
to please other people, to use our time and space on this earth to then, to serve. When we have a group of people and a system that's still very much chugging along, that is extractive, is trying to
Mhm.
still bolster this level of hierarchy, it can be really challenging when you're used to trying to people please or even just serve. And you have this inherent messaging that's been given to you through years of socialization and indoctrination that like power is bad for you to have. So if you have any of it, get rid of it. But also hold it enough for you to be able to feed yourself and everyone around you and notice how people are trying to grab it from you. And it's fascinating as we look
Mhm.
about even just like economically, how in the last 20 years, how money has moved in, again, we're talking capitalism in and of itself, which is, again, we can dive into that for hours, but how money has shifted even more polarized and even more
Mhm.
stretched from the collective. How our way of even just consuming information has been like repeating the words of other people versus having our own kind of
Mhm.
individual thought or space for it. Even though we think because we have social media platforms, we now have our 15 seconds to get on our soapbox whenever we want. But oftentimes we don't realize when we're regurgitating the same things that a few people in power had, or whatever the kind of metric of I think of like societal power currency makes you feel like, all right, I said the thing, I'm good, I gotta go. All right, I reposted this quote, or the black square in and of itself was its own version of like,
Mhm.
I'm using my space, but I'm also not necessarily stepping fully into that by if that's the only space and the only way that I'm doing this. I would love to hear as you I want to go everywhere with that. I feel like the way you answered that took up so many things. A big part of when I was hearing you talk about the shift in your relationship to power, or our relationship collectively to how we understand and notice power, a big part of that was understanding what it is and the permission to take up space, whatever that kind of looks like, being able to take up space and know that by taking up space, it doesn't mean you're taking it away from like there's enough space for all of us. The idea that there isn't, there are many pieces of a pie. It doesn't mean by me existing as myself, you can't exist as yourself. Can you talk a little bit about that as we've talked about, especially when we have a culture of fat phobia that I think, obviously, well, I should say I think, and obviously, that tends to hit women
Mhm.
more significantly, and not that it doesn't hit men, but there is an entire just normalization of women's bodies needing to be a certain size, and if they are not, it is I don't even know, there's so many words that would be used for it. The thing that always comes to my mind is women taking up space. I think of Lizzo showing up on all the red carpet she's been showing up on lately, and people making comments about her clothes taking up too much space, or making fun of her clothes, but really it's because you're uncomfortable that a woman that takes up space physically, personality wise, in all that she does, it has dares to take up more. I think, I'd love to hear as you're talking about what it is to kind of reclaim your own individual power. I know one of the things that you've done is your radical self-love through the practice of selfies and kind of
Yeah.
taking up your space out in the world. Can you talk a little bit about what that was, and how that kind of has intertwined with all the things we've been talking about?
Yeah. I think that the discourse around taking up space is so interesting, and who gets to take up space and how we take up space. And I agree with you that like there's no space scarcity in this way that we're told, or that we're taught, or that is ingrained in us. And I love Lizzo's giant red dress on all of the red carpets. A red carpet in and of itself, it's really glorious. I think for me, I'm trying to decide what angle to approach this from, but like I think there's one level of I'll start with a little bit more about taking up space and talk about selfies, but for me taking up space has really been about learning like where to expand and where to contract. But it's actually maybe more been about just like who do I want to be visible to and who do I want to listen to. And so there are places, when I'm in places, I would say with like more normative values, like
Mhm.
I don't know, like I joined the Chamber of Commerce here for my business. And when I'm in the Chamber of Commerce, as one of the few women there, like maybe the only millennial woman there, I am very happy to take up massive amounts of space because like it is business as usual over there and that should change. And so that's like one relationship I have with that type of space. But then when I'm in other spaces, I really, say, in the past, for instance, when I lived in Chicago, I worked with the Chicago Torture Justice Project. And, that's an activist organization that's serving people who have experienced police violence. And so in those spaces, I'm not there to take up space, right? Like I'm there to kind of devote myself and my privilege to this collective cause, but I'm not there. Like I'm not the reason we're collecting and I don't need to like disrupt that space in the way that I'd love to disrupt the Chamber of Commerce space. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
I think so much of like that has been the big like one of the lessons I've learned about taking up space and where and when I want to bring my identity or my body to spaces in different ways. With selfies, it really became, it started as a very personal practice of wanting to heal a lot of my self-loathing by learning to look at myself. And I learned to look at myself. A lot of people will do mirror gazing or other things, but like as the good millennial I am, it was all selfies. I mean, I used to take selfies like on a disposable camera. I have like literal
Yes.
printed out from the CVS pictures of selfies I took that
Yes.
exact pose.
Yes. Yeah. Like,
uh,
where is the button on this Kodak thing? Yes.
exactly, exactly. So, I really just brought that practice that I had on kind of as a fun thing for a long time. Felt very natural to do that when I was trying to learn to see myself in a different way. And I had studied the male gaze in school, and I kind of knew, I knew that the way I was conditioned to look at myself and to look at other people was inherently objectifying. And so I was really trying to figure out, like, how can I look at myself without objectifying myself? Or how can I look at myself without judging myself? And then how can I look at myself without hating myself? And I started taking selfies and I started sharing them. And, after I broke up with diet culture, as I got fatter, I just took more and more selfies, honestly, and less clothing. And then I'm just like on the internet in my underwear with my fat body on display. And, I really did that as it felt empowering to me at that point in my practice to be visible and to announce to the world that I loved myself in this body that I had previously hated, been afraid of. I spent so much of my life trying to avoid ever being fat. Um, and then I just was, and I could love it anyway. Love didn't come first. I would say like acceptance. At first it was kind of a tentative, like, I guess this is fine, and I could accept it, and then I could enjoy it, and then I could love it. Like I think I know a lot of people bristle at the word self-love, but I do think it's possible. And I support body neutrality, and I understand the value of those movements, but I wanted love. I don't want to feel neutrally toward myself. I want to feel in love with all aspects of myself. Not because they're perfect or awesome all the time, but because I choose to love them. And so selfies really gave me that. And it's interesting, I don't really take that. It was definitely a period of my practice. And I think I got to that place where I could really say I loved myself. And I don't need selfies to believe that anymore, to feel that anymore. And I don't take as many, I think partially because I left social media. But I just think it was such a powerful practice for me. And I led a few dozen women and non-binary folks through that practice a few times. And I got to see how powerful it was for them to establish new relationships with their self-image.
Wow.
And now every time someone's like, oh, I hate looking at pictures of myself, I like link them my like free selfies course on my website. And I'm like, you should try this. It's free. It's 7 days of free selfie prompts. You can do it. I want you to enjoy looking at photos of yourself, or just enjoy yourself, really.
I I hope those of you that are listening to this are letting this land, especially if you are anybody who has felt like your body is lacking in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is truly so beautiful to create a harmonious relationship with this body that you have while you're here.
Yeah.
And, it's so funny because I personally spent a huge chunk of my life thinking of my body as like a machine,
Mm-hmm.
as the vehicle, as the thing that needed to be fine-tuned or, adjusted or manipulated in a way to be able to serve a purpose. And at the same time took that machine for granted, assumed that it was going to be able to do and weather whatever I put it through, whether it be physical or mental or emotional. And that whole time, I mean, I grew up playing sports. So as an athlete, my body was the thing that needed to get me up and down the soccer field, heading the ball, kicking the ball, all that stuff. But also the more I explain it this way a lot of times, when I stepped into adulthood, when I stopped playing soccer, when I went into work, it's like I lost my body. Like I started losing my relationship to myself. And I always say, like, started from the feet and was going up. Once I was in the workplace, the amount that I had to cover, how much space and how curvy I was and how feminine my body was and all the stuff, like how objectified I would
Mhm.
be in that space. And therefore the Jezebel nature that I must have had by saying it, it was fascinating because not only was it a covering, but it literally was, I like detached from any element of wisdom that machine that was not a machine, it was a companion, it was a source of so much information my whole life was giving me. And that then
Mhm.
created a whole cycle and spiral of health issues, of my ability to completely dissociate the value that I have in this world. And so it is something that's not just about, what's the size of my clothing, or how does my body look compared to this other person's, but it really is, I think. And as you're talking about body neutrality again, my whole take is, your beliefs are your beliefs. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I
Mhm.
agree in the level of self-love. If your companion, if you think of your body as your companion the whole time you're here, even if it stops being able to do all the things that it can do right now or it once did,
Mhm.
being able to have a harmonious and loving relationship with that companion will
Mhm.
hopefully create a smoother, more enjoyable life as you move yourself forward. And so, it's really fascinating because in my 30s, I have been intentionally started working with somebody that's an embodiment coach and really tapping into understanding elements of why my body does what it does, and that it isn't
Mhm.
something to feel ashamed of or to ignore or to shove down, even if the world is constantly telling you that. Like, before we hopped on, I was telling you how I love so much that this is 4 years for you, because I spent the entire morning trying on clothes for a photo shoot that I have, which I haven't done a photo shoot in years. And I also bought clothes that don't fit that came here, but I moved with a bunch of clothes. And so I was trying on like everything that was in my closet. That's like, some of this stuff's like a decade old, right? So there's all these different versions of myself and different versions of my body that showed up as I was doing that. And it was really challenging, as you're talking about kind
Mhm.
of mirroring or seeing yourself, of being like, wow, look how my body's changed. Or, okay, maybe I can't wear that, or, what will people think of that? All those things that, even though I have a much more foundationally secure relationship with my body than I've had ever. And my body is not necessarily culturally where it used to be, but I don't really care about, like, I genuinely don't look at my body and go, ugh. But it really is
Mhm.
interesting when you are putting yourself in a position where you're like, all right, so I am actually going to have a photo taken of me that will have to be me outside of somebody experiencing me. What will that mean? How does that feel? And how
Yeah.
can I have a relationship with that reality that isn't toxic and isn't deteriorating my sense of self? And so I love
Yeah.
so much that selfies are an opportunity to do that. Because again, if you have a phone, and I'm assuming if you're listening to this, we have a pretty high percentage of people that listen to podcasts on their phone. That is a way to just even play with this. It doesn't need to be some huge revolutionary thing that you start with, right? You can just try it out, see how it feels, see if there are things that show up, and give yourself permission to evolve, to learn, to
Yeah.
grow. And maybe at the other side of you're like, I didn't like that. That's okay too. But the ability to really watch yourself heal things that
Mhm.
may or may not have known were broken, or felt off, or felt like there was less of yourself there. I think there's so much power in that. And so I am so grateful, one, that you are sharing this, but also two, that you have this amazing opportunity for people to download a free opportunity to step into this for 7 days. Like, why not? So I'll say
Yeah.
this, the podcast for me, we will drop that into, we'll make sure we put a link to that in the show notes so people can join. And I feel like I want to do it. But I am like,
Yeah.
I just feel like there's so much power in witnessing yourself. And so whatever that form
Mhm.
comes to now, it doesn't necessarily need to be the only form, is really, really powerful. So thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah. I think that, I really think what it comes down to, Nikki, is that it's what this podcast is about too, right? Like Checkbox Other, to me, it's a podcast about belonging, like acknowledging where we feel like we don't belong, stepping into places we feel like we do belong. And I just think that selfies can be a way to belong in our bodies. I mean, selfies can be a tool to learn how to belong in our bodies and belong to ourselves. And selfies are that self-witnessing piece. Like, our relationships are so fulfilling, and feeling witnessed by another person can feel so supportive and beautiful. And I seek that all the time in my life. But at the end of the day, the only person you can count on to witness you is you. And so many of us are so dissociated from our bodies. We're so divorced from ourselves. We've been, violently torn away from ourselves in this society. And I think any practice I can do to come home to myself, to get back to myself, to witness myself is something I always want to step into. And so that is really what selfies were for me. And, the easiest practice, just if people want a place to start. I mean, of course you can go download the 7-day course, but, I just always recommend set a timer for 5 minutes, take selfies for 5 minutes. It might be excruciatingly long. That's okay. Put on a playlist first. I always put on a playlist,
Yes.
set the timer, take selfies for 5 minutes, and then sit down with a journal and look through your selfies for 5 minutes and write down your inner dialogue. And a lot of
Oh,
people, when they see how they talk about themselves, when they look at themselves, it becomes a real eye-opening moment. And you can learn to be more gentle with yourself. And then if you are saying negative things, write down something nice about try
yeah.
to you that heals you.
Yeah.
Choosing to give yourself a compliment, choosing to step into a different relationship is so healing. I mean, if I could tell you how much of my life I got back when I decided to stop hating my body,
Oh,
so much. I got so much back. Time, energy, relationships, just so much. I want it for everyone.
yes. Oh, it reminds me of, what is it called? Here's Leo Grande. Hello, Leo Grande. I love
Oh
you, Leo
yeah.
Grande.
Yeah, one of those.
Yeah, when Emma Thompson is standing in front of the mirror looking at herself and she hasn't
Mhm.
looked at her body in however many years, and really seeing herself for the first time in the same way. I mean, I don't know about you. One of the things, see, if you look at my TikTok, or you look at, which I know is, we'll dive into social media. I mean, I spend so much, TikTok knows I love a good, reunion. So people not seeing each other for a long time, waterworks immediately. That ability to reunite with yourself and give yourself
Mhm.
permission to be in awe of this body that you have, like as a kid being like, oh my God, look at all this, having that kind of relationship with yourself of discovery and of learning and of reconnecting is so powerful. So, well, I was going to save this for later, but I'm going to bring it up because I feel like we've talked about it a bunch. Uh, can you talk a little bit about, I don't know, I was going to call it breaking up with social media, but we just talked about breaking up with diet culture. So I feel like I need
Right.
another language. Divesting from social media. I know that it is something for you recently, last year or so. You've decided to no longer participate in what I feel like is the job that social media has
Yeah.
become. I remember, I mean, you and I were both around pre-social media. So Facebook came into my world my freshman year of college. We were, because it was based in Boston, a couple of schools in Boston.
Mhm.
And it was obviously very different in the old days of Facebook. But even when I think of something like Instagram, that always felt really fun and like sharing and, impromptu and authentic, it has shifted so significantly. And at the same time, because that shift has become about monetization and hierarchy and power and
Mhm.
influencer status, it has started to be more of a life suck, a excitement, joy suck than it used to be. It used to be something that was like, oh my God, look at anybody else. Mine was started as a food blog, love food. So it's like, look at all this amazing stuff that's out there. You've got to go here and eat that, right? And now it's like a cost of doing business. I remember even when I was working in 2008, I was working for a consulting company and I was trying to tell them we need to get on social media. We need to just exist on social media. And there was such resistance to it. And now, I mean, if you don't have a social media account as a business, where are you? So can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about how you made the decision, and also how I'm right when you posted it, I was like, let me listen to this. How you see us evolving away from social media in a healthy way that allows us to reconnect with our humanity and also still allows us to be able to thrive in the things that we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. The social media swirl is so much. So for my journey with social media was, similar to yours in that I got on social media. I got on Facebook late high school. I got on Instagram late college. And at first, my Instagram was very much like a scrapbook that I shared, friends and travel and fun stuff. And, when I first got on Instagram, I didn't have an iPhone. I had to have an iTouch. I had to use my iTouch to get on Instagram because
Right.
I didn't have a smartphone.
Yeah.
That like wasn't a thing. Most people didn't back in 2012 or whatever. Um, but over time, I think I started sharing different sorts of things when I started the feminist mantra project that became 50 feminist mantras. I really started kind of shifting my profile more toward content creation, and that became more toward influencing. And then I started doing some general like promotion of products, and then I got the book deal to turn 50 feminist mantras into a book. Well, I had already self-published it, but I signed a book deal with Andrews McMeel to rework the book and publish it with them. And that's really when I was like, okay, I spent half of my book advance on social media strategy and a website branding redesign and photos so that I could promote this book essentially. And I really went all in on Instagram for a year. That would have been kind of late 2019 through the book came out in October of 2020. And I had a whole content strategy and I did all of this work and I doubled my following. I think I went from like 1,200 followers to 2,500 followers. Not a big, I'm not here to claim I was a big influencer. I'm definitely in micro influencer world. And I looked around toward the end of that year and I was like, what have I gotten from all of this work, from all of
Yeah.
these nights I spend on the couch next to my partners, moving the posts around in my planning app, feed app, like literally just like I would just, move them around
Yep.
and later or whatever I had.
Yep.
Hours and hours and hours. It was definitely part-time job number of hours for sure. And brain
Yeah.
power. I had
And that's
jobs
not
based.
even interacting. That's not even
No,
interacting with people.
that's
That's
just
just
planning
post.
content.
Yep.
Yeah. That's just the content planning and posting. Yeah. So, that fall, I think there was kind of an early movement to leave the platform is kind of what I saw. A friend and mentor of mine, Mary Grace Allardyce, posted this really beautiful podcast episode called Your Deep Alignment is a Portal. And it was all about her decision to leave Instagram as a business owner because it was so misaligned with her values and the way she wanted to share her work. I watched her do that. I watched Lush leave Instagram. Well, maybe that came later, but eventually in early 2021, to get back to the story, the start of 2021, I was like, I am so burnt out on Instagram. I'm going to sit down and make a list of boundaries. I was like, I need to have some boundaries here. I was like, I cannot be on this app so much. I cannot let it make me feel bad about myself.
Yes.
And I wrote this pretty like intense list of boundaries that I felt I needed with Instagram. Things like I will log on Mondays. I will post this thing. I will check for this number of hours. I will log off. I will come on these days for these reasons. I will close my DMs. I will do XYZ, whatever it was. And as I was like taking that handwritten list and typing it up in my caption app, I had this breakthrough moment that was like, the only times in my life I've needed this many boundaries was in really toxic relationships. And with those relationships, I left them. Like that's how I healed. Like the boundaries weren't enough. I had to leave to really heal myself in those situations. And that was just this real breakthrough, eye-opening moment where I was like, I have to leave Instagram. Like this is not working for me. Was in this codependent, anxiously attached relationship with that app. And I always say, like, I spent way too much on therapy to work on those areas of my life to just
Yeah.
willingly do it with Instagram all the time.
With an algorithm. Yeah. With
With
an
an
algorithm that's
algorithm.
constantly changing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, there's no way to be securely attached to Instagram, in my opinion, which is what
Oh,
I
yeah.
want in my relationships in life.
Right. Right.
Um, and so at that point, I decided to leave. It was also incredibly apparent to me that the values of Facebook, now Meta, of Instagram, of social media in general, were really contrary to my personal values. Like I got really into reading about the surveillance that happens online. And I was just realizing how like surveilled we were, how much our data was harvested and sold to other people, how much was
Yeah.
being extracted out of us purely by being on these apps. And so I decided I was going to leave.
On these free apps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Free except for all that you just paid for without knowing. No big deal.
Yeah. And I also started to notice, just how much money I spent because things were advertised to me so much. Right. And that sort of, I follow a brand and then I see their posts and then I get their ads. And then because of all of the tracking pixels, like there's the ad on Instagram, there's the ad in my inbox, there's the ad when I Google something, and like that. I don't care how strong or conscious of a consumer you are, that works at your psyche, at your subconscious levels. And you buy more than you need. Like when I left Instagram, I immediately dropped like a couple $100 a month in spending. And I was like, huh, wild. I guess
Maybe
I have
that
less.
wasn't a free app.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, well, I guess I have less leggings now, but that seems fine. Like, not a problem.
That's amazing.
Um, so yeah, so I decided that I announced I was going to leave Instagram in early 2021, and then I left in April of 2021. So I've been off Instagram for a year and a half now.
Nice.
After I left, I launched my business, Softer Sounds, and Softer Sounds has no social media plan. Our profiles, I do have an Instagram profile for the business because of exactly what you said, like social proof. It's like, if you're not on social media, do you exist? I've
You don't have a
had
storefront? Yeah.
yeah, like that's like, it's it. If you're not on Instagram, are you real? And I've had people submit customer inquiries that were like, are you open? Your Instagram doesn't have anything on it. And I'm like, yeah, it says I don't use Instagram on there. But I think that it's been a real journey. It's been really fruitful, and really, I document all of this in my podcast, Off the Grid. So if people are interested in this, I have a whole episode
Yes.
on the story of how I left Instagram. I've got a whole like 5-step plan for how you can leave a social media platform. I've got a lot of then really just like how to market yourself off of social media. Like I unpack that over 19 episodes in the first season, because it is, let me tell you, Nikki, it's really freeing over here. I feel so, sometimes when I feel stressed about marketing, I'm like, this is fine because I never have to write a caption, or I'm like, this is like, I can write this email because I've never had to make a social media calendar for my business.
Yeah.
And, I'm not naive. I like have a lot of business acumen, and I know that not everybody can just like, leaving Instagram may cost you your business. Like I believe that.
Right.
But I think I made a lot of strategic choices in the type of business I run and the type of services I offer, because from the business side, I just think social media promotes this very specific type of online business. And that's just not the models that are being sold to us as online business owners right now, are not actually feasible for many of us. There's a really great essay that Tara McMullen wrote recently about how like she created a social media following when like Facebook paid her to have a Facebook group that she posted in. Like the people with the giant audiences who are selling us these like, launch a
5-step
course,
plans.
all the plans, they did that with like a subsidized model that's not available to us. And so I'm really trying to kind of be in a different marketing space and help people see that like you can have a business without social media. In fact, you can have a very successful one. It just may not be exactly the business you thought you were going to have, because that $9 course that they told you to offer is not going to work if you don't have a 1 million person audience, even on social media. So anyway,
Right.
I'm going to step off my soapbox, but
Like to hear.
yeah, I have a lot of feelings about the business influencers of the world too.
Well, and I think there is in the same way we were talking about the dilution of the word feminism, I think it's the same energy as we're talking about what social media was and the power that it had in creating connection and creating a sense of additive value to your life. And now there is somebody, and now I'm gonna talk TikTok. We didn't talk TikTok. TikTok in its own way. I'm like, how have I been here for 2 hours? What just happened to my life? It's that particular app in itself has an addictive element that I feel like others don't. However, there is somebody that I follow on TikTok who talks about the fact that internet is on its way out. It's in decline and it's dying. And these are the reasons why. And he starts mapping them. I forget what his name is on TikTok, but I will make sure I put it in here. But he actually gives case study examples of other companies that have done exactly what Instagram, Facebook, Meta are doing, and the signs and the symptoms that are actually, it's like not necessarily last gasp quite yet, but that there are a lot of elements to these companies that have been around and are supposedly holding so much clout over all of us, but are actually kind of dying on the back end. And we're feeling it, but we don't know that's what we're feeling, and how powerful it is to really understand yourself separate from these forces and these places that have kind of, like you're saying, like the pixelation, like the pixel tracking. How many people say, oh my God, my phone's listening to me? It's like, well,
Yeah.
not necessarily that, but it's not that. Like
Yeah.
the ability to, again, reclaim. And I feel like the world we live in right now, privacy is something that's a challenging thing to really feel like you fully have.
Mhm.
Um, but being able to choose where your attention goes and where your decision making is coming from. And also, I think, as you were talking about the type of business that can succeed in these spaces, yes, the ability to live this highly filtered life that is, being bankrolled somewhere that no one can see, but you can make it, pull,
Mhm.
bootstrap yourself through this.
Yeah.
But also, the thing that's so interesting about social media and just our behavior of Twitterifying ourselves in short amounts and bully comments back and forth is that there's not that much room for nuance. So if you're doing work that needs a level of depth and a level of nuance and a level of time and space or critical thought, these platforms are not encouraging that kind of slower pace that you were talking about, that kind of level of curiosity, growth, and evolution, even more so, because it's like, well, look at this post you did here. There's a punitive dynamic to how that works. And so I think it is really powerful to think about, what is social media to you? Yes, is it there? Is it something you look at first thing in the morning and when you go at night? Yeah, that's something to think about. But also, like, what is it adding and subtracting from your life, and giving yourself just the permission to ask the question. You don't necessarily have to mean you're never going to be on there again, but just kind of reclaiming and understanding and awareness of how much it's a part of your life, I think, is really powerful. So one of the things I want to make sure we talk to is what I know you spent so much of your time doing, is your dissertation that you did at
Oh,
the
yeah.
that you did talking, right? And you're like, oh yeah, that
I'm like,
thing.
that thing?
Yeah. I'm so curious because as we are talking about, I feel like I've used the word dilution so much, but as we've talked about our relationship changing to words, and when words are being used in different places, and when different experiences mean something to us that might be the complete opposite in meaning of the same word to someone else, it is important to really take a deep dive in understanding kind of the history and all the elements of intersection. So can you talk a little bit about your dissertation that was talking about the relationship between feminism and aesthetics?
Yeah, definitely. I never get to talk about my dissertation. This is great.
And
Um,
I will do my best. I will tell you this. Sometimes when we talk dissertations, I might like raise my hand and be like, can I ask a question like a kindergartner
oh
here,
yeah,
just in case?
I
So,
will I will keep it out of the weeds. We will not go into
okay,
the
thank you.
weeds.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess the way you framed that, like relationships to words. So my dissertation's on feminism and aesthetics. A lot of people, when they hear aesthetics, they think like estheticians, and they think like beauty
Mm.
regimens, and they think like plastic surgery, because you have these like aesthetic centers that offer a lot of cosmetic procedures and plastic surgeries. That is not what I studied. My esthetician was really like, she was like, that's what you did. And I was like, no, we don't do the same thing. I'm sorry. Like, what you do is great. What I do is great.
Yeah.
They're not the same. Um, in philosophy, aesthetics is the study of our experiences of art and of art itself in some cases. And so really the core of my dissertation was me trying to understand and argue that I felt like there were two very similar gestures in feminism and in aesthetics that invited us to experience the world without like predetermining what we were experiencing. So aesthetics and like the philosophers I looked at, they were trying to understand like, how is it that when we look at beauty or look at nature or look at these like beautiful or sublime things, often what brings us pleasure is that we don't quite know what they are, and that could be pleasurable or very scary.
Yeah.
And so often that could be our experience of art. Like we look at something and it really just kind of opens us up. We don't know quite what we're looking at, or it's an experience that's outside of our ability to immediately conceptualize it. And I just felt like
Mhm.
that. I love that. I've had that experience of art so many times in my life. And then I felt like I was learning that in my aesthetics courses. And then within feminism, I think there's this more like imperative that we choose, like an ethical obligation or imperative of some kind, that we choose to embrace other people without predetermining what they may be in and of themselves or to us. And so my dissertation was really trying to look at those gestures of like, and then sort of make an argument that like our experiences of art can teach us how to interact with others in that way without predetermining what this may be, and that is like an ethos and a way we can move through the world. So that's the high level version of the project. It was kind of based on this painting I saw by Carrie James Marshall. I just had this really profound experience in a museum, and I wanted to write about it. And then I wrote, hundreds of pages about it.
I think I spent a little bit of time thinking about it,
Yeah,
spent some time, spent some
few
years,
years.
no big deal.
Yeah.
That is incredible. I did not know that about aesthetics, first of all. So let me join into that. I just was like, oh, this is about beauty and our
Yeah.
experience of beauty in the world. But the thing and the amazing gift and the part of me that was like bubbling over, like the kid in the first row that has a question, is like hand in the air, but my body was like, you absolutely, this is it. This
Yeah.
resonates even more. Is, one of the things I have a lot of coaching clients do when they're trying to figure out what they want to do next, or when someone's trying to, figure out like, who am I versus what have I been doing, is something called light up moments. It's an
Mm-hmm.
exercise. It's literally like notice in your life the things that light you up. And
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing it, I remember my first foray into what was not called light up moments at the time, but doing that myself. And I actually nudged myself earlier this year to do that. So I came to New York for 6 weeks to test out living here. And while I was here, I wrote down all the things that lit me up that I wanted to try to experience here and see if I could find, and how challenging it would be, but also what it would feel like. And I'll make sure I actually, in one of my group coaching calls with my clients, I actually read them my list, because sometimes it can feel like, what do you mean? Because,
Yeah.
oftentimes I'm like, do you like talking to somebody when you're going to get your coffee? That could be a light up moment. Do you like, when, something is just so, or do you like the ability, like, do you like shampooing your hair and giving yourself the ability for your brain to like actually process things without having to go a mile a minute? Great. They can be these huge things. They can be really small things.
Mm-hmm.
And I went down and I read this. And what I noticed was a huge theme was my obsession with feeling a sense of awe, of the world around me, a sense of awe that gave me both the sense of like, I am a human being, that it's a miracle that I'm here, but also I am so insignificant in the larger scale of everything that's happening in this world. And yes, does that come with a sense of amazing and fear at the same time? For sure it
Yeah.
does. But also being able to witness the spectrum where you're swinging between that each and every moment of the day is what I feel like personally for me is so life affirming, is so life giving. And
Mm-hmm.
so as you're talking about the ability to witness the things that you might not be able to understand, process, or in my mind, what I wrote here was categorize, because we're in checkbox
Mm-hmm.
otherland and we talk about the
Yeah.
fact
Yeah.
that we're so often being told to fit in boxes, that it is more than okay to experience the world without being certain about or boxing things into a certain space in order to be able to enjoy, witness, learn from, evolve alongside. You don't have to know the answers before you allow yourself to ask the question, or even you don't even have to just being there. And I think there's so much power in that, on top of, as we were talking about earlier, the witnessing of power, a relationship to power that's different than power over. So often when we're talking about seeing new models of things, or as we're talking about representation, even, we have to imagine what we can't see. And so I do feel like
Mm-hmm.
there's a part of us stepping into what I like to think of as, a more authentic and inclusive way of living that centers a lot of feminist principles,
Mm-hmm.
that we have to give ourselves the permission to step into the unknown and not necessarily know everything in order to create a new normal, or at least a new operating way of operating with one another that isn't as, oppressive and toxic as where we are. And so I do think there's so much power in, yeah, I first of all, so excited that that painting brought all of this to the forefront. But I do
Yeah.
think that life in and of itself, being able to bear witness to that and make those connections and not feel like you have to have it right or do it perfectly is part of like this whole, instead of being I always talk about, we're human beings and not human doings. If we're constantly focused on doing the right thing and fitting the box and getting a gold star, we're not going to allow ourselves to be in the moment and to witness those things and to be able to kind of witness what our path forward is. And so I'm if you almost stopped, I could talk forever about this, but I don't know, did that resonate? Because part of it for me
Yeah.
was like, oh, she just blew my mind in the word aesthetics. So I don't know, how did that land for you?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one way that philosophers will kind of uh categorize this is like the difference between the beautiful and the sublime. So like the beautiful, often beauty is thought of as like harmony. Like we experience pleasure from beauty when things exactly meet our expectations. Like when it's just like the perfect example of something, right? Or you're like, I experience harmony when like I get off work and I'm like, I really want ice cream and I have like exactly the ice cream I want. And that's such a good feeling. It's
Mhm.
kind of the same feeling when you perfectly check the box. You're like, I accomplished that and I did it. And it feels so good because I knew exactly what it was going to be. And I got that.
Yeah.
Right. Like there are these like pleasures we get when expectations are fulfilled. But
Mm.
part of what even brought aesthetics into being was philosophers being like, well, why do we get so much pleasure sometimes out of like not being able to have an expectation, or just like coming into these moments where like we can't figure it out, we can't categorize the thing. And I think that's exactly what you're speaking to. And I think you're so right that those moments, they're often very uncomfortable, and I think a lot of people shy away from them just in favor of the sort of like, let's have everything meet my expectations and keep with that type of pleasure. But to me, like all the good stuff in life comes, it's like it's as simple as being like when you're outside your comfort zone. But it is like that's what we're invited into in our experiences of the sublime. And there's so much in life that can do that for us. And I also like think that, I think there's like I personally feel like an obligation to embrace discomfort, to be willing to be uncomfortable, because there is so much difference in the world. And I think like, beauty and harmony invites us to like flatten and ignore difference. And I think that what we're talking about, like the sublime, these like bigger aesthetic experiences, deeper aesthetic experiences, they invite us to really like step into difference and sit with it without reducing it to sameness. And again, that like reduction of difference to same, that's a power over technique. That's a dominating technique. And to some degree, that's what philosophers like in my dissertation would say happens every time we like see something and apply a concept to it. And I like look at my computer, I'm like, computer. Like I've
Technology, yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
all right,
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
I've basically taken this thing I don't understand and turned it into something I understand. And I'm not here to say that like that's it's a very like philosophical sort of argument to be like, well, there's a violence in that of naming things. But that's kind of what I think what you're talking about, what I'm seeing in these moments is like when we can take something in without having to name it or reduce it in any way. Um, that's gorgeous
Mm.
and can be so hard. Some people are so unwilling to do that. They
Oh
need
yeah.
to like know everything, control everything. But I would say that's like problematic impulse.
Well, I think it's a it's a limiting way to exist in
Yeah.
times, right? In many times in your life, because there's especially, especially right now, as the foundations we've been operating on as safe and in control are crumbling, in some places literally
Yeah.
crumbling. Like
Yeah.
it is important to regain a sense of comfort with the unknown and comfort with yourself. And bringing back to, our
Mhm.
conversations about our relationships with our bodies. When we're talking about this stuff, so often, again, I think of myself at like 22, once I detach from the bottom half of my body, like we just play in our brains. If we can figure it out and we can name it intellectually, then it's okay. But what if we don't? What if we allow our
Yeah.
bodies to react to it? What if we allow like these stuff that's outside of our understanding of our cerebral processing to actually add to our experience of being human versus being afraid of our inability to control or know exactly what it's going to do or what it's going to feel like is incredibly powerful. And it's so funny because, so funny. A lot of when I talk about, women's leadership models or feminine leadership models, it's not necessarily that men can't be here, none of that, but there is a huge part of embracing the understanding that like an alternative way of living is believing in the things you can't see, is understanding the power of things that may not necessarily fill the criteria buckets that we've been told in a very specific model of like straight,
Mm-hmm.
you need to start here and get to the goal there before everybody else, and really give yourself the ability to kind of circle around a little bit and learn and stumble and bring someone else in and actually boost each other at the same time. There's so much of that is a willingness to step into the unknown and not be in control, to be able to trust inherently your intuitive self, and to be able to actually trust other people around you. It's hard to really believe that as a cornerstone when we've been taught that it's a hierarchical situation. You can't trust anybody because we're constantly competing to win. But if we actually allow ourselves that space to witness and be in awe of how humans can come together, how the world actually can heal itself. I don't know if you saw that. There's a documentary on Apple about the year that the earth stood still. Why it can't come out of my mouth, I don't know. But it was about how how nature was healing itself as we were all inside for COVID. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, we can scientifically put it in boxes and tell you why, but like, you didn't know that was going to happen. We didn't know that was going to, we also don't even know what we don't know about what's happened in the last few years of us getting out of the way. And so it's really, really fascinating to find comfort in not knowing the answer, because it gives you so much more permission to actually exist and be as things are happening, and allow yourself to feel those things, those moments of awe or uncertainty that allow you to maybe chart a different path forward than you've ever seen before, and trust that it's okay to maybe do something that no one's done. So I just want to say, I'm so for as we know, when I started, I was so excited for you to be on. This is even more than I could have imagined. This was so wonderful. Is there anything that you want? Oh, one of the questions I had was about softer sounds. So do you mind talking a little bit about softer sounds and how, if people are interested, they can get in touch? Why softer sounds in particular? What I'm so excited about is it's a feminist podcast studio, and that it is really important. One of the things when I was doing podcasting early on, especially inviting people on the podcast, because early on I was inviting people that had never been on podcasts. They were so afraid for their voice to be heard, especially women were really afraid for how their voice was going to sound. Can you talk a little bit about, one, I guess, the choice of softer sounds, and two, what it's been like creating that space and how people might be able to work with you if they're interested?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way to wrap us up. I think, it's, after everything we talked about, I did all of this work in all these areas. I, studied philosophy, wrote a dissertation, I studied feminism, and I wrote a feminist journal, and I did all these things. And then I started a podcast company, which is a little different. But I think, it all ties in through just like the way that we can embrace our voices and learn to share and speak. And I think that that's a really powerful act. Which is funny because my partner wrote most of a dissertation on speech act theory. When I say that, now that I'm thinking about philosophy again. But I started Softer Sounds in July of 2021, so just over a year ago now. And I started it because I had been editing podcasts for a long time, which is, how we met, what I was doing for you for a while. And then I moved and I took a part-time job, and I kind of actually moved away from my podcast editing, and I let go of most of my clients. And then as I was in that job, it was a great job, but I just realized that like jobs were not for me. Like I just really value time freedom almost more than anything.
I know this. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I couldn't do it. Like being on a set schedule, having to ask if I could go on a vacation in 6 months. Like I just, I couldn't do it, and I could start a business. So I decided to do that. So I launched Softer Sounds, kind of to be the podcast studio I wished existed, which was a space that was not tech bro centered, that didn't have like a gray and orange website or like teal website like all of them do, that really would be able to bring together like a technical skill in podcasting, of course, but also like a really safe landing space for people to share vulnerably about things happening in their lives. And I think most of my clients come to me because they want that, like, again, it's about witnessing. Like, I think Softer Sounds is a podcast studio that can witness stories that are often not told. And editing is such a art of listening and
Yep.
shaping a story. And I think that, what I really do is work with women and non-binary folks as my editors and as my clients, and we come together to really help stories shine. And so it's been a really beautiful way to support women and non-binary podcasters, and also like to create a business that really embodies my values. Like, I really like working on the business as much, if not more, than I like working in the business.
Mhm.
I'm always hiring people to do the podcasting parts so I can just work on the business more.
Yeah.
But I really do try to have an emphasis on, removing urgency from the business and on supporting, our the people that supporting our clients and supporting the people that we work with that support our clients, and really trying to make a space where people can share what they need, ask for what they need. We can do our best to meet each other where we can.
Mm.
Because I've worked in so many spaces that are just like, everything's rushed, everything's needed at the last minute. I've talked to so many of my clients, and most of them have had an editor before that they feel like just like didn't even listen to the episode. Like, they'll tell the most vulnerable story of their life, and the editor will just be like, audio's done. And I'm always over here being like, oh my gosh, that was so special. Thank you for
Yes.
sharing. Like, it's just about like care. It's so much about care, and just imbuing podcasting with that care, because it can be such a like, the industry is so focused on like the tech of it all. And so I'm really trying to bring tenderness to all of that. And so if folks are interested in starting a podcast, you can definitely just go to softersounds.studio. I have a wealth of free resources there to help you get started or to help you improve
Yes.
your show. I just launched a really, like, literally last night, I launched a magical 3-step podcast audit for podcasters. If you have a show and you want to learn how to like analyze your show and cast a spell for podcast success, like, I like to do a lot of
Yes.
magical stuff.
Yes.
um
Adding to playlist now. Yes.
yeah, I want to bring my full self to my business and to my work with my clients, and so that's what we do. So um it's a real joy. I love doing it, and I really enjoy it.
I will tell you, first of all, everything she just said is true. She's not just saying it. Like, I was, as a former client, so I was so nervous to bring in an editor.
Yeah.
Uh, when I don't even know how long I did the podcast, but it felt like a million years, because I would take like 12 hours to edit, which is
Oh,
ridiculous.
it's
Like,
real.
remove
Yeah.
every graphic, like, it was just silly. It was silly, and it was perfectionist, and it was, I was trying to make every guest, as I mentioned, a lot of my guests are early, it was their first time, and the marketer I am by trade, or have been by trade and education, wanted them to look the best possible, and it wasn't, look, no one could see them. So it was literally like, I wanted them to sound as great as possible as they were uncomfortably sharing something really vulnerable. And still, it took so much away from me enjoying the experience, because even in it, I was thinking about editing it. Even in it,
Yeah.
I was out of it. And so but at the same time, bringing somebody else in to be able to hold such really powerful and important stories. And also, I put my name on the line. I assured these people this was a safe
Yeah.
space to do that. And I will tell you, when I first started podcasting, looking out into the kind of editor options, it was super bro-y for sure. And it was
Oh
like
yeah.
super transactional. I'll do this really quick. I'll cut this. And it was more like, all right, I'm going to look this up and see this. I'm just going to cut, like, it's like a math problem. And I'm like, this isn't a math problem. Like,
Yeah.
these are people telling their stories. This is like full on
Yeah.
humanity on display. We can't create like a short circuit hack to this.
Hmm.
And so having somebody who got it
Yeah.
and also felt it was so powerful and so important. And I think so often when people are thinking about either being on a podcast or starting a podcast, there is this fear of like being misconstrued, being misrepresented, not saying the right thing, my voice sounding bad, my technology being wrong. Like there's all of these things that create procrastination and imposter syndrome. And I do think that the sense that you're putting that humanity and the importance of bringing your story forward in a way that is authentically who you are is incredibly powerful. I'm not trying, it's not, my gig is not to try to change who you are based on my beliefs or what you're saying based on that stuff, because I'm very aware, right? You're coming to the table very, very aware of how you see the world and how the world has shaped a lot of different things. And you have the active ability to make choices on how you interact with what you do. So there's, again, so much wisdom that comes from all of the credentials, official and otherwise, that you have, that you're bringing to the party here, that have so much of an impact on the experience that people have in working with you. So I'm excited. If you are somebody that is interested in starting a podcast, I mean, how have you not? How have you emailed Amelia yet? Like,
come hang.
No, I want to hear about it though. So if you do, and you reach out to Amelia, or if you're nervous to reach out to Amelia, but you just want to do, like, let us know. Don't worry. You are coming in for a soft landing on this stuff. Softer sound, soft landing. Didn't even mean it. The world does need to hear what you have to say. It is important for you to be able to take up that space. The podcast world is an amazing way to take up space, because all you need is an RSS feed, my friend, and a recording device. So thank you so much. Truly. I just need you all to know we had never seen each other until this moment. We felt like we have known each other for years, but this was such a wonderful gift. And thank you all for being a part of it. And I can't wait. I can't wait for all the amazing things that I'll get to bear witness, not on social, but otherwise, that you are bringing to this world. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. I can't wait for what's to come. We don't know what it is, but I can't wait for it.
Hey, I'm ready to be in awe. Let's do it. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Wasn't that conversation just so wonderful? I could have spoken to Amelia about each and every one of these questions for an entire podcast episode easily. We ended up talking for a little bit afterwards because we were just so excited for all the amazing topics we dove into today. This was for sure a very meaty one. And for anybody that knows the type of work I do, if I can jam on feminism and understanding the nuances of ourselves as we create a more liberated society, you know that it's my favorite thing to talk about. And to be able to do that with another person who is so deeply knowledgeable and also so inherently wise on so many aspects of the things that feel like they are really confusing or really vague in this society that we have now, to be able to create opportunities for so much clarity and aha moments in this episode was such a wonderful gift. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I did mention, if you are somebody that's thinking about creating a podcast and you want to share what that idea is, definitely let us know. You can go to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast and share information there. Or if you follow me on any of the socials, I'm at Nikki Innocent on all of them. Feel free to drop us a direct message and let us know about your podcast idea. Or if anything else in this episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear it. This was such a gift and such a joyous thing to be able to have shared with Amelia, who was here from such a, like, not from the start, but pretty close. And I'm so excited that you all got to meet her. I cannot wait to see you on the next episode.